Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and I have, as you can see, two guests with me today. One is Nicola. I can't pronounce her last name. I'm going to let her say it. Go ahead.
Hannefeld, Nicola Hannefeld.
And she is the author, go ahead and hold up the book, of this book, The Unspeakable, Breaking my Family's Silence Surrounding the Holocaust. Now, what caught my attention was that it was a particular period of the lead up, in effect, to the Holocaust, to World War II. And then when I asked her to begin the show, she said that she needed to have, or she wanted to have her partner in crime in terms of research, Rick Pinar. Did I do that right?
Yes, very
He's
good.
an American historian with an abiding love for Prague, which is where he is now. Nicola's in Southwest Germany at the moment, and Prague, Bohemian, Central Europe, and he supported her research with his extensive knowledge of this period. So before we get to what Nicola's book is about and how you helped her, just tell us, after World War One, where was Sudetenland?
Well, essentially what happened, of course, is what was later called the Sudetenland, where the mostly German inhabited and German speaking border regions of Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia. Those were the three constituent provinces that became the Czech lands and part of Czechoslovakia. And what happened was in late 1918, as the war was coming to a close, the Czechs declared independence from Austria, and there had been a great many Czechs fighting with the Allies in France and Italy, in Russia, against Germany and Austria, against the Entente because they wanted to have their countries separate. And essentially, what happened then was that these provinces, the mostly Czech populated provinces, declared independence, and the German population within those provinces, however, did not want to be part of Czechoslovakia, forming Czechoslovakia. They wanted to join Germany or Austria, and be with their ethnic brethren, as it were. However, that would have made the state fairly unviable right from the beginning. And essentially, the Czech soldiers then returning from the fronts formed a local army and insisted that the German regions also join Czechoslovakia. Although it was really against the will of virtually the entire political representation of those areas of the provinces.
Okay, now wait a second. Nicola, where was your family at this point?
They were in the northeast region of this is kind of like a horseshoe
Right,
around
right.
Czechoslovakia, and they were in Troppau, which is the German name, and today it's called Opava, which is the Czech name. On the very northeast border to now it's on the border to well, it was then as well, wasn't it? On the border to Poland, Rick.
Well, there was the close. It was very close to the border with Poland, but it was actually at that time just over the border was Silesia, the German Silesia, Prussian
Okay,
Silesia.
there you go. It's very, very complicated.
Close,
I
close.
know, and I'm already okay. So, so, and what were their occupations? What did your family do?
My grandfather was the managing director of a sewing threads company called Gütermann, which is a German Jewish company. And so he was in charge of this factory making sewing thread. And he had met the grandson of the Gutermann founder of the Gutermann company before World War One. So he was great friends with the Gutermann company, and he was asked to set up the company there, and that's where he met my grandmother as well, in Troppau.
So now, what happened in the 20 years between 1918 and 1938? So,
Well,
do people get
mhm.
along?
Well, eventually, some aspects of the German political scene were willing to work with the Czechs. For instance, the Social Democrats the communists, some of them, and some more sort of left of center parties and democratic parties they were in Czechoslovak governments as ministers sometimes, and so they developed a certain modus vivendi with the Czechoslovak government, and were active and also productive, and positive towards the state for a long time. Unfortunately, then later, starting with the Depression started to set in the after 1929, the situation in the border regions became much more dramatic in terms of unemployment and problems. And with that, that already underlying negativity among German conservative circles, anti-Semitic also some of them, really picked up. And first it was called the Sudetendeutsche Heimatfront. That was meaning Sudeten German Home Front, which was eventually forbidden. And it was replaced then by the Sudetendeutsche Partei, the Sudeten German Party. And that really picked up under this sports teacher from Northeast Bohemia named Konrad Henlein, who was really a Nazi and working with Hitler at some point, even though he was on the surface being very loyal, but it was complete disingenuity really on his part, or disingenuousness on his part.
So, why did Hitler think that he was going to be able to get the Sudetenland? When did his demands start? Nicola, do you want to talk about that for a minute, just in terms of your family's
Mhm.
antenna?
Yes, I think Hitler was at least a year before he annexed the Sudetenland. He was sending out signals, is that right? At least a year beforehand,
Oh,
that
wait,
he
wait, just to
needs,
remind everyone, Hitler took power January 30th, 1933. Okay,
yeah,
so now he's
yeah.
taking away rights from the
And
Jews
he's
a little bit.
always into expanding into the east because we need more Lebensraum. And this was part of Neville Chamberlain's appeasement politics, saying, "Oh, you can, yeah, this is where when it got to the Munich Agreement, saying Hitler, you can have the Sudetenland, but I can see from my family documents, my grandfather." I own his bookkeeping from 1937, 38, and he stopped bookkeeping in the middle of 1938. And he was a very meticulous businessman. So they were, I think that's a signal that they were already planning to emigrate to England, enforced unfreiwillig, I suppose, spend the whole day talking German, involuntary immigration. But how many years before the annexation of Sudetenland was Hitler always saying we need it to integrate, Rick? Is it 2 or 3 years before October 38?
Well, I mean, that's maybe when he started actually speaking out loud about it, but
Yeah,
the
Yeah,
cooperation between him and Henlein went back to 33, I would say,
yeah.
34. I mean, there were political murders in Czechoslovakia by Nazis already in 30, say 35, things like
Mhm.
that happening, spies from the Abwehr,
that's
this
the
kind of,
German military intelligence.
correct, yes. And and already in the last really free elections for parliament, the Sudetendeutsche Partei came in as the largest party of any. Uh, and it was, larger than any of the Czech or Slovak parties. And that was in 1935. So
Mhm.
that you see, it's already the momentum there was
Mhm.
really building strongly. And there were, they had little grievances, the Sudeten Germans. There were things that they got all strung out about, but I can't, so far, I've not discovered any of them that would justify what they then later did, or Henlein and his people did.
So, okay, so let's move us up to September 38th. So, and who called the conference? What happened? We know all of us know Neville Chamberlain got back to England and what peace in our times.
Mhm.
And now, Nicola, had your family left by this point?
They left in October 38.
right
And
afterwards.
the annexation was November, wasn't it, Rick?
No, September. Well,
Um,
okay.
well, the
When?
invasion of where your ancestors were living, um, like Opawa would have been invaded in by the 10th of October,
Yeah,
38.
and they left just before then. Yeah,
But the agreement was signed September 30th, 1938, in which
Yes.
right, that's what I
hmm
meant in terms of, so your ancestors were smart. They saw the writing on the wall before
yeah,
other people.
Yeah.
But this meeting that was called in September of 38, so Chamberlain came to what? Tell Hitler not to. I don't understand that. Can you take us through that?
Well, essentially, Hitler was threatening Czechoslovakia with war. And of course, Britain and France were direct allies of Czechoslovakia. They had been since 1918, or since during World War One, actually, even before the state existed. And so essentially, what happened was Mr. Chamberlain was very interested in avoiding war. Mr. Daladier from France, sort of as his closer ally. And so they, instead of allowing Hitler and Czechoslovakia to start a war, which would invariably lead to a general European conflagration. I mean, the great fear was, think of it, this is just 20 years after the ending of a horrific war where millions of people died, and the effort by any sane person, really, to an extent, was to avoid something like that happening again. So what they wanted to do was avoid another war. And so Mr. Chamberlain, got Daladier on board. They got Mussolini, who had been the guarantor of Austria's independence, but he had gone along with this annexation, which was in March of 1938. It was it was not a forceful annexation. The Austrians were thrilled for the most part, although they wouldn't admit it after 1945, of course.
Yes, of
But
course.
But anyway, so the meeting was called with these powers, these four powers, Germany, Britain, France, and Italy. And it was to avert the war, it was simply this bully, this Hitler threatening to start literally a war. And
But why didn't they invite the Czechs?
well, because uh, yeah, it's the complete arrogance of the situation, the complete tragedy of this country that Hitler didn't want to come to an agreement with the Czechs. He wanted to simply
Mm.
annihilate Czechoslovakia. He wanted it to, and the narrative later was that it had fallen apart because it wasn't a viable state, which was nonsense.
Yeah.
Uh, so, and where Nicola's family was living was a very mixed German Czech. I'd say it was, what did we determine, Nicola? Something like 38% were Germans, 40% were
hmm
Germans,
Yeah.
and the rest were Czech. So it was a very, very mixed region. And you had this huge Nazi party, which in the end, but before Czechoslovakia fell, they had reached a peak of 1.35 million members of
Mm.
this local Nazi party. And that's out of a population of about 3.2 million so-called Sudeten Germans at all.
Mm.
So, I mean, it's a huge culpability among these people for what happened, which then later, after the war, led to some pretty grim results. Anyway,
So,
did I answer your question? I'm
yes.
sorry.
So I actually have read, and I know, okay, not an historian, that there were Czech troops, one of the reasons why Hitler wanted this so badly from the very beginning was this was the kind of where the Czech government had its armament factories. Is that correct?
No, I wouldn't say that the armament factories themselves were mostly there. They were more in the interior of
Oh, but the
Bohemia,
military was,
but the border region was highly fortified. It's a
yes,
mountainous
that's what I
region.
meant.
It was mostly a mountainous region along the border with Germany, and I mean pre-war border, which stretched out to, far east of the country. So Czechoslovakia was, I mean, the Czech lands were surrounded on really three sides by Germany and then one side by Austria, and the south. And then Germany took Austria in March of 1938, and so suddenly the Czech lands are just like this, I don't know, fish with everything but the tail, surrounded by German territory. And the Austrian border was in the flatlands largely, and not really defended as around the border towards Germany. So that was the thing. It was heavily fortified, the border region, and those bunkers are still out there. You can still see them. People, there are people that keep
So,
them up.
does the world say anything? Or they just say, oh, that's nice. You just diverted war. And Nicola's smiling. You want to chime in here with
It's just I'm smiling because there's a bee flying around. Did the world say anything? I think Neville Chamberlain was greeted heartily in Great Britain for having averted war, but it gave the United Kingdom time to rearm because 38 they wouldn't have been ready for war, if I'm correctly informed. Um, but this appeasement politics, I mean, today we still just use the word Munich and appeasement, and lots of parallels going on, of course, in Eastern Europe again today with appeasement politics and not being clear towards dictators that obviously want to destroy and create destruction and annihilation. Yeah, so my family was out of it. They got into England. They went via Switzerland. They left in the beginning of October 1938 and spent 4 or 5 months in first they left Troppau, then they went to Prague, where my father went to school for 1 month, and then they went to Zurich, where there was a friend of the Gutermann. My grandfather's friend Heinz Gutermann was there, and they by 1938, March 1938, 39, sorry, they were in Great Britain. Yeah,
now were they put in internment camps later
they were not in internment camps, no.
because they were Czech citizens, correct? At the time
You
that they,
you find lots and lots of documents where people are emphasizing that although they're German speakers, they are Czech citizens, which is incredibly complicated
yes,
because they spoke German. My grandfather never learned to speak good English. My grandmother was fine with English, but there must have been a lot of tension for them. And this is one of when I was doing my family research, it took me ages to comprehend. And thank you again to Rick that I started understanding how Czech and German, how these two ethnicities were intermingled and the different roles of the language. And I only found my great grandmother via her Czech name, although she was a German speaker.
interesting. So
Yeah.
I take it though that when they got to England, there was a lot of hostility because they had German accents.
Oh, I don't think there's hostility. No, they were wealthy. They didn't stay
Oh,
with
so
Quakers.
they took their money with them.
Somehow, I don't know how they got money there. My father and my aunt, they both were straight away sent off to boarding school. How that was all possible, no idea. They must have somehow. They probably had help because there was a Gutermann branch in England. So there was a lot of background working and support, but they didn't stay in a refugee camp or anything. They stayed in quite a smart hotel place that actually still exists, although it's not a hotel anymore. Yeah.
What I meant is, but people didn't like recoil because if I'm correct, in the summer of 38, not of the summer of 39, weren't there sandbags in London from the TV shows that I watched before Chamberlain went to Munich?
I think
You
people were
remember,
already preparing war.
right?
People
Right?
knew it was coming. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I just so right. I have that thing about sandbags outside government buildings, but in 38, before Neville Chamberlain went to Munich, and then everything was hunky dory, and no one said it. The world press didn't say a word, like, right, Rick?
Oh no, there was considerable coverage. A friend of mine from Radio Prague, David Vaughan, for instance, he did a very interesting analysis of what the different radio. It was the first major crisis that happened on the radio. So, which was a not a new medium, but a relatively new medium at the time, and it was followed. So, no, of course there was coverage. There was in the radio, in newspapers. I mean, the world knew what was going on. I think that a lot of people just did breathe a sigh of relief. Oh, thank God we dodged that
Mm.
bullet. because
Mm.
it was getting very, very tense in late summer, early autumn 1938, and it looked like there would be a war. And as Nicola mentioned, Britain was not prepared for it. They had let things slide, in the French exactly too, because everybody, it was only 20 years earlier
Mm.
that that horrific war had ended.
Mm. Mhm.
So imagine like if we'd
Mm.
had some horrific war in 2005 and
Mm.
everybody was still traumatized from that, had lost brothers, cousins, nurses, sisters,
Mm.
whatever. Um, and then 20 years later, you think, oh my God, this is starting again.
Mm.
Nobody wanted it. And I think they had avoided, they had like mentally just put it someplace where no, we're not going to think about this. And then
Mm.
suddenly they realized, oh, but Adolf's thinking about it and it's looking pretty serious. And
Mm.
regrettably, Czechoslovakia got to pay the price for it.
Mm.
And wasn't there a famous statement of that Chamberlain said something about that country so far away or something? I forget what.
Mm.
As a faraway country about which we know little.
Mm.
I will just tell you a personal story. So in 1971, I was working, my husband and I were stationed in Munich with the US Army, and I had this finally got a job fighting the army, et cetera, et cetera. And I worked with a German woman who had been a teenager in Munich during Kristallnacht, which comes 2 months after our, as we'll continue our story, because I would like to make a point later about how the synagogues in Sudetenland were also totaled that night. And I said to her, and I don't want to say that she was a dumb woman. She was just, I said, well, why'd you want to go to war? I mean, she said, well, Hitler said we needed more living room, and that made
Mm.
sense. And every time I think of Miss Winkler saying that,
Mm.
I go, but where was the living room supposed to come? The living room supposed to come from.
The
So,
Lebensraum.
Lebensraum, space, living space. Yeah.
yes, yes. So now we move up to November 9th of 1938, which we're not going to go through it now. The Nazis actually had this program planned before. They had an excuse, blah, blah, blah. But what I'd like to talk about for a minute is the fact that while we always talk about Germany, synagogues, Jews rounded up, etc., and we sometimes talk about Austria, we don't talk about the
Yeah.
Sudetenland. And yet, when my daughter and I were in Czechoslovakia, oh, sorry, we were in Czechia a few years ago doing this project, we finally realized that, oh, those synagogues were really not only destroyed, but the Jews were moved out of that land almost immediately. I mean, not put in camps, but literally moved into the interior of whatever was left of the Czech Republic. And
Well, that
so
was. Mhm.
I mean, just talk about that. I just talked about it, but you explain more.
Well, it behooved them to leave because the situation was literally physically dangerous. And so it was I don't know, wasn't voluntary, it's not the right term, but it was like a self-deportation, to use a current term, because they had to flee for their lives. And really, there were estimated to be about somewhere between 22 and 29,000 Jewish people living in those border regions. And of those, all but about 2,000 fled into the internal area of the country. Nicola's relatives were very, very intelligent and clever and foresightful that they did it on time. Because some people left it a bit late and then ran into trouble. And they didn't only run into trouble from the Nazis, but they ran into trouble also from the Czechoslovak government, what was left of it, in this so-called Second Republic, because they didn't want to be flooded with basically German-speaking people, even if they were Jewish, from these border regions. They think, okay, no, you have your home in those border regions unless you opt, and there was a certain time limit to opt for retaining Czechoslovak citizenship, which, for instance, Nicola's
Great
aunt,
aunt. Yeah.
great
Great
aunt
aunt.
did.
Yeah.
If you didn't do that, then you could literally be turned back at what was the new border. And some people ended up spending some days out in no man's land, even though they had been Czechoslovak citizens up until that point. Um, and others got trouble with it later, but then Uh, so when we're talking the Second Republic is October, November, December, January, February, and the beginning of March 1939. In that period, the situation in Czechoslovakia also became worse for democracy and for minorities.
Okay, wait. We are going to get to March 30, 1939, because this is another date that I think that Americans and everyone else doesn't pay a lot of attention to. But do you know how many synagogues were actually burned or vandalized during Kristallnacht in Sudetenland?
I know that Troppau it wasn't on the 9th and 10th of October, 9th and 10th of November. It was about a month later. But we researched that, didn't we, Rick?
Yes, yes. It was weird, yeah, because not all of them not all of them were destroyed. There are still some that exist, even in these Bohemian Moravian border regions. But not all of them went up on this so-called Kristallnacht. It was some of them, like for instance, in Teplice, this very mondaine spa town in this North Bohemian border region. It wasn't burned down until March of
Mm.
1939. And then I think the local Nazis thought, oh, come on, let's burn it.
Mm.
So what
That
happened in March of 39? So
oh well, then basically what happened in March of 39 was Hitler
who
um,
had promised no more land grab?
right. He had promised, no, okay, I'm satisfied, there'll be peace. But then he decided, no, not so much. So he essentially instigated the Slovaks to declare independence. He had the president of Slovakia, the prime minister of Slovakia, he was a Catholic priest, come to Berlin. And he said, basically, you declare independence or we're going to give you back to the Hungarians, where you were before 1918. Hungarians were on Hitler's side. And so basically, the Slovaks declared independence, and Hitler said, oh, well, obviously the state is falling apart and it's unviable. And so I have to protect the Germans that were still like under 4% of Germans still living in the Czech land, so I have to protect them. And so he invaded the rest on March 15th, 1939, except Ostrava, where also some of Nicola's relatives were living, and that was invaded the day before.
Mhm.
Because he just assumed that the Czechoslovak president would ask him to invade, which officially is what the narrative was.
okay, so let's back up for a second. So Czechoslovakia after World War One was put together with Slovakia. Czechos. Okay, so now Hitler invites just the Slovakian part, which are more anti-Semitic. Is that correct? That's what I've.
Uh,
You don't have to
well,
answer if I could be wrong.
it's a bit hard to say because for instance, there are a lot more righteous among the nations in Yad Vashem from Slovakia than there are from Czechia, even though Czechia has much larger population. So I don't know if we can say that in a blanket manner, but essentially what happened, Czechoslovakia was when it was formed, it was Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia, Slovakia, and Subcarpathian Russia, which is now part of Ukraine.
Wait, which was
And
Ruthenia, right?
yes, exactly. Yes, another word for Ruthenia, yes. And so Hitler instigated Slovakia, which was that sort of central part well, eastern part, uh, to declare independence, which they did. And yeah, and so then the state seemed non-viable at that point. But it's
And
all instigated by him, you know.
right, and the military had already been withdrawn from Sudetenland, the Czech military. So there wasn't really, I mean, at that point, the Czech Republic, or whatever we're calling it at the moment, couldn't defend itself. Is that right?
But they didn't want to fight, if I'm correct. They decided not to fight. Is that right? Banish said,
Well, I mean, they very much wanted to fight in September of 38, but by March of 39, all the fortified border regions are in German hands, and the Nazis actually said, "Oh my God, we must never let these people do this again because it was seriously defended. It was like the Maginot Line, in
Hmm.
France.
Mhm.
So it was a really seriously strong defense, but it was gone at that point. And what you had were these central Bohemian and central Moravian flatlands. I mean, these are plains. You can drive a tank over them fairly quickly.
Hmm.
And
I want
with
to
good
ask you
roads.
a question. If Neville Chamberlain had not agreed, could Czechoslovakia have held out on its fortified regions long enough for Britain, etc., to be geared up? Was that a point in time when the Nazis could have been stopped? Maybe. I mean, I'm asking you to look just
I know it's sort of I would say it definitely would have denied the Nazis a great deal of armor, which they got from Czechoslovakia and all these factories that produced bombs that were falling on London the next year. A lot of them had been produced in Czech factories. Tanks, machine guns, all those things. This was from a lot of there was a lot of production of that here. Think of the Skoda works in Pilsen with their huge
Pilsen's like the
artillery.
beer for anyone who wants to know. I've been there for a couple hours.
That's right, Pilsen like the beer, but it also had the Skoda works, which was this massive, massive armaments factory with all sorts of artillery and what have you, and all that Hitler just got to keep, got to have planes, everything. The Czechoslovakia had a huge, huge military complex, and he got it all. And so Mr. Chamberlain and Mr. Daladier then got to suffer the effects of that, and unfortunately, their
Mhm.
populations also.
Hmm.
So, if we think of what happened in September 1939 with Poland, I mean, essentially, Germany and the Soviet Union occupied it, and Britain and France didn't really do much about it. They were sort of in defensive mode at that point.
Wasn't
And
it
I
called the
imagine,
false war or the
Phony war.
yes, drôle de
phony war?
guerre,
Yeah.
the phony war, phony war. So I think probably Czechoslovakia would have faced something similar. They would have probably fought, I mean, reading newspapers from the time and other documents from the time, I think they would have fought tooth and nail. But Prague would have ended up like Rotterdam or Warsaw or something, and it would have been a complete and awful bloodbath. But I think it would have cost the Germans dearly and the Austrians, and I think it would have weakened them severely and certainly not added to their military might as taking over all that material did. You know. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, no, I'm just thinking about so now we have the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and we have this Slovakian government that's allied, sort of, right?
Yes, under Tiso, under
Yeah.
it's like a puppet state, sort of allied. It had a bit more free room than Bohemian Moravia, but you have to think of the Protectorate as this sort of theater piece that the Nazis wanted to put on and pretend that, for tactical reasons, say vis-a-vis Holland, Belgium, Yugoslavia, other small countries in Europe, Denmark, that they wanted to project this image of this okay, occupied but otherwise autonomous state running itself. And that was a fiction from day one. That was just nonsense. They didn't have everything in their hands from day one. There was still room for resisting them and sabotaging to some extent, and what have you. But they very rapidly got a hold of things.
Actually, I should ask you off camera for a project of mine. I still can't find the answer for why the Nazi officer in charge of the whatever confiscation of Jewish property allowed the Jewish community of Prague to collect the tours and everything else. And instead of taking them over, to store them in storehouses, for which we have the Czech tours of today that are all over. But I've done just, preliminary research. His brother was a right-hand man to Eichmann, but I still can't find anything about him, basically.
What is the name?
I can't remember right now.
Oh,
He just kind of disappeared afterwards. And there are various theories as to why he would have agreed. Was he into books? He did have them do a couple of special shows for his Nazi colleagues, but it's an anomaly. So I just wonder whether that fits into this overall narrative of hands off in certain areas, even though there was a Czech immigration office for Jewish, right? I think it's in one of three places.
Yeah, Eichmann set up in Prague. Yeah.
Yeah, right?
He confiscated some Jewish villas, one for himself and his family, and one for his central office for Jewish immigration
Exactly.
in
But yet
Prague, in
in Prague,
Szczecin.
right? But yet he
Prague.
left alone. It's I find that another mystery that maybe you'll solve because I'll send you the information afterwards. So Nicola,
Okay.
we only have a few more minutes left. What would you like people to know about reading your book in general?
That it's a book about family research, how you can get cut off from your family's past, and what it means to open the door to the unspoken past, because I knew nothing about my Jewish heritage. Why this book is perhaps a little bit different from other Holocaust memoirs is that I include my research experience. It's interwoven into the narrative. So this lived experience of what it's like to discover what happened to the people who didn't leave in time. So there were two sisters of my grandfather and their husbands, and my great grandmother. This is my grandmother on the front, and her name is Mariana. And Mariana's mother, her name was Therese, and she was transported to Treblinka at the age of 76 in October 1942. So it was very traumatic and very, very sad writing it. It also impacted my identity, and I understood how, because my family didn't talk about all this.
Wait, but did you
But
know you were Jewish or not?
I'm not Jewish. My father was the Jewish one, and he was brought up as Catholic, and being Jewish goes through the mother line. And but in
Yeah.
England, we were just nothing. So I know nothing about Jewish anything really. I'm very cut off, but it changed my impacted my identity, and I think it's also a book inspiring readers to research their own family because the past is always present. I grew up with this unknown. I didn't, you can't, as a child, you can't know that something is not there because it's not there. How can you identify something is not there? But reconstructing everything, and I was very close with they were wonderful grandparents. They made a clean cut, and that influenced me, but I didn't know that it influenced me until I started writing. And I had to get through this barrier of this inherited barrier of not talking about the past, not addressing what had happened to two of my grandfather's sisters, my great grandmother, my grandmother's mother, and their husbands. And they would just kept looking forward. And I think I live in Germany. I've lived in Germany since 1981. And the other side, that's why the book is called The Unspeakable, because not talking about the past is why don't you talk about the past? Because it was so horrific. But the other side of the unspeakable, of course, is I only know four people in Germany who say my father was a Nazi. So my kind of what I gleaned out of doing all the research is that millions of families are still traumatized by World War II. But if you don't address it and look into it, how are you going to resolve it? And that's why I was so grateful for Rick's support, because as you can see and hear how much he knows, but he was also emotionally very present. And it was, I mean, I spent hours weeping while I was writing this book over my computer. Looking back, I don't know how come it didn't get a short circuit or something, because it was so sad. And it was just this sadness, this endless grief and sadness and horror. I mean, it would just overcome me again and again. But on the other side of it, we did go back. My cousin supported me with the research. That's the daughter of this little girl here, my cousin Jules. We actually we found the house that my grandparents left in they left in October 1938, and 2016 we found this house, and it was incredibly moving, but also very healing. And they'd only lived there for 9 years. My grandfather had made this house for his family, Nine years, and there's this sign outside this house where the initials of my grandparents are, 1929 is written, so that's when they moved in, and already in 1938 they had to leave. But so, and this, I think my cousin and I, we picked it up as children, but not consciously. And so it's resolving a lot about resolving past trauma and understanding what unspoken trauma does to you. So, but that's the story of the book. Yeah.
Okay, and Rick, I'm going to ask you one last question. What got you interested in this particular part of history?
Uh, Golly. Um, well, I was doing my master's work. I wrote about Czech radio during the occupation here at Charles University, and we had some distant relatives from here, very distant uh, Jewish relatives, and I just sort of one day a very very nice Russian archivist at the National Archives said, "You know, the police files for Prague's Jews still exist." And I said, "Really?" And so I started looking up some of the people, and there were, you know, from Holocaust victims, and they're like photos for when they applied for passports or driver's licenses, or when they got parking tickets. And there were these, funny little, a quirky little collection of documents, and you could really see a great deal from different
Mhm.
people's
Everyday life.
everyday life. Exactly, yeah.
I think
And
you even found out that the car that my grandfather owned a year after he left Czechoslovakia, he got somebody, the bloke that stole it got a parking ticket and it was still registered under his name. That
that's
kind
right.
of stuff.
And the
Yeah.
Nazis were looking to find him, and he was missing.
He was not driving the car. No.
That's right. So
Yeah.
funny.
He
But
was
I have
learning
to
to
say,
drive on the other side of the street, road, right?
yeah. But
So it was
Nicholas,
everyday life that gripped you, isn't it? And that's how the unspeakable benefited because he could put everything into context. Yeah.
but your family also had so much. I mean, the book has fascinating things that I hadn't seen before, like your relatives who were in Vichy France, your Austrian
Mm,
relatives. And I
mm,
mean, it's just, my God. I mean, that was a whole area that I had
mm,
just sort of touched upon. And here you have these people who survived Vichy France and managed to escape
mm,
to Switzerland.
mm, mm,
Just fascinating stuff, and so much.
mm,
And there are so many families about from whom there's, even
mm,
a photo doesn't exist. But there
mm,
was so
mm.
much really fascinating stuff from Nicola's family.
Like
So
I put the name of my grandfather, Mariana, she had a brother, his name was Alfred Wilhelm, and it was February 2022. I just put Dr. Alfred Wilhelm. I knew he'd done a PhD and he was a lawyer. And this archive, 1,000 pages in Zurich came up.
Wow.
Absolutely stunning. Yeah. And I asked them to digitize it and they sent it to me. And so I can retrace because they didn't leave for England. They couldn't because they had no chance to work in England like my grandfather had. So I had to plow through 1,000 pages to reconstruct what happened to this family. As Rick said, first they went to Paris and then they were in Vichy, France on the run for 3.5 years with 17 suitcases.
17 suitcases.
And yeah, so it's all in there, all these letters, and that got is one of the chapters in The Unspeakable. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
remarkable. It's utterly,
Yeah.
that's not the only thing. That's like one of them. Just
Yeah.
incredible. Uh,
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
okay. Obviously, the audience needs to read the book and see Rick's hand in the research. And I thank you both so much for coming on the show. I thank my listeners, but I do have to say, in the memory of all those who were victims, especially at Treblinka, which they had no chance, just
Mhm.
complete extermination camp, and those who tried to save them, be it blessing
Mhm.
for